Jesus isn't coming just to take revenge and to just so we can gloat on what God through Jesus is going to do to our enemies. But again, this is an expression of God's holiness and justice in sending His Son, this rider on the white horse, to exact judgment and justice on the rebellious and those who resist Him, those who have harmed God's people, and now it's like the first few verses are preparatory for the battle that's going to be described in the rest of chapter 19.
Hi, everybody. It's Sandy Laws, and I'm excited to have Dr. David L. Mathewson on the podcast today. He is our expert on the book of Revelation, and we're going to do something a little different in this episode. We're actually going to walk through chapters 19 and 20. And honestly, these two chapters are kind of intense. There's like a rider on a white horse. There's this vivid imagery of judgment. And then this very small but curious reference to the Millennium, which apparently has caused quite a controversy for many, many years, as Dave will explain to us why. So grateful to have David back with us, and we're going through his book, A Companion to the Book of Revelation. I would highly recommend it. And Dave, I know you have a follow-up to this book, so tell me a little bit about the follow-up to this.
Yeah, the follow-up book was actually after I wrote that book, the editor approached me and asked if I would write this follow-up book, which is Uncovering the Treasures of the Apocalypse. And what it does, it goes through 5 principles for interpreting Revelation. And those are mentioned in the companion that Sandy was just holding up. But what it is, it goes through 5 principles that anyone needs to keep in mind when you're reading Revelation to make sense of it. And we've talked a little bit in the last couple podcasts about some of the difficulties in approaching the book from our 21st century perspective. And so what this does, it looks at things like, what was the historical background? What kind of literature is this? We talked about the story, reading Revelation as a story and not just, in little pieces. What are the major themes? Again, not just getting caught up in end times, but what are some of the themes? How do we apply this? So just, and giving a lot of illustrations from Revelation itself for how those principles work in actually interpreting the book.
Well, it sounds like it would be worth it to have both of them if you really wanted to spend time in this book, which we've decided is a good idea. And we know that you have spent a lot of time in this book, so I know you have a lot of helpful insights for us, because I haven't spent that much time in it, other than when I was in your class, and it was part of what we studied. But it's so much more interesting to walk through it in the way that we've been talking about it, big picture, context, how people respond to it, why they're afraid of it, why they shouldn't be afraid of it. And your book really helps to give us something to hold on to, something really solid to hold on to as we're going through it. So by the end of this book, you feel a lot more comfortable with the book of Revelation. And I know that today we're going to feel that way as we go through chapter 19 and 20. So Dave, when people get to these two chapters, 19 and 20, there's sort of a mix of curiosity, but also confusion, some nervousness about what's going on. Before we dig into it, give us the big picture of these two chapters and what you think is the best way to approach them.
Yeah, good. A couple things. First of all, I think starting with chapter 19 and verse 11, the first 10 verses of chapter 19 actually belong with 17 and 18. the
Okay,
judgment
you
of
mentioned that, yeah.
Babylon, which I think for first century readers, they would have seen Babylon was Rome. And chapter 18, I think, makes that very clear. So chapter 19, verses 1 through 10 is heaven's response. Chapter 18 is basically the earth's response, the merchants, the kings, those that have become wealthy off Rome. Now they say, whoa, whoa, they mourn for Rome. But then chapter 19, 1 through 10 is heaven's response, where they rejoice because Babylon has oppressed God's people. Babylon has been unjust and evil, and so heaven responds in rejoicing because God has demonstrated his justice and his holiness in judging this wicked, evil nation. Then starting at verse 11, which is, Sandy you mentioned the rider on the white horse, with chapter 19, verse 11 to chapter 22 is now we are at what theologians call the second coming of Christ. This is the final coming of Christ to bring to conclusion, to a culmination, God's promises of both judgment but salvation. And so one way to look at it is chapter 19 and 20 then is basically the final judgment of God on the wicked, rebellious, whereas 21 and 22 then are the final promise of salvation for the people of God on the new creation. And the second thing is to look at chapter 19 and 20 together can be seen as, I call them, a series of removal scenes, where God is removing in judgment everything that stands opposed to the establishment of his kingdom on earth. Remember, we said Revelation is about how does that scene in 4 and 5, how does that become a reality on earth? Now God is removing in judgment, the end time judgment has a second coming. He's removing everything that stands as a barrier to that and his people's enjoyment of that. So he removes the two beasts in chapter 19, and then in chapter 20 he'll remove the dragon Satan, and then at the end of chapter 20 in verses 11 through 15, there's a kind of this is the great white throne judgment. This is kind of a sweeping up scene where all evil is removed. Everything that stands, even this present creation that is the home of the dragon, the place where the dragon and the two beasts operated and carried out their deceptive activity, even that is removed. So that by the time you get to the end of chapter 20, there is nothing left except for the establishment of a new creation and the fulfillment of God's promises to establish his kingdom on earth and to reward his faithful people by salvation in a new creation.
I mean, I love the imagery of removing everything that's a problem, because we live with it, we know it, and so it's, I don't know, I find it comforting to know that God knows it too. He knows it has to be removed, and in order for us to really enjoy what he's created for us, you have to start over, and this is the way he's going to do it. Well, let's go specifically into Revelation 19, verses 1 through 10, although you say it belongs to really 18, which is this big celebration in heaven. And these first 5 verses describe rejoicing and praise in heaven. Speak a little bit more about what exactly is being celebrated, who exactly is celebrating, and why are they so joyful?
Yeah. And that's very important, because it'd be easy to read this as kind of a ha ha ha, you got what you had coming to you. But again, what they rejoice is, God has demonstrated his holiness and justice. And we talked a little bit yesterday about how, at least in the United States, we don't experience persecution and threats to our lives because of our faith, at least not anything like people living in other countries do. So I suspect we often don't realize what lies behind this. And I watch the news all the time, or not all the time, but when I watch the news, you often see people, when someone has taken the life of a family member unjustly. I mean, what do they want? They always want justice. And when that takes place, they are happy or sad whether they think justice has been done or not. And I kind of see that in a way as a parallel to the cry. This is not just a cry of revenge or gloating. This is a cry of rejoicing because justice has been done. In fact, back in chapter 6, the fifth seal, the saints cry out, "God, how long, O Lord, till you avenge our blood?" And he says, "Well, wait just a little while longer." And so now here's the answer to that. Is it would be unjust if God did not respond in justice to the suffering of his people and to the injustice that has been done towards his people. So I think the way to understand this is in response to the fall of Babylon in chapter 17 and 18, this is a cause of rejoicing because God has He's shown his justice, his righteousness, his holiness in avenging the suffering of his people.
I mean, justice is such a big topic, and, we look to the Lord when we feel as though injustice has been done, and sometimes we want to take it into our own hands as well. I mean, now and then people want to take it in judgment and justice into their own hands, but I think it's going to be at a completely different level, the type of justice that we'll be seeing. And I think nothing is more appropriate than to be grateful for that to be happening. So in verse 7, it introduces the idea of the marriage of the Lamb. So can you explain more about this verse and what this marriage represents?
Yeah, so the image of a marriage relationship is not new, obviously, to Revelation or the New Testament. It goes back to the Old Testament, especially the book of Isaiah, that portrays the relationship between God and his people as a husband to a bride. But also along with that, the image of unfaithfulness, the image of adultery that you get even in Revelation. The idea is they have, people have been unfaithful to their relationship to the Lord. And so now what we find in chapter, and here it might be helpful to read it in light of the rest of the New Testament. For example, in Ephesians 5, you find Paul referring to the relationship between Christ and his church as a bridegroom and his bride. And so one way to look at it, I think, is right now we could see it as kind of a period of engagement, which they would have taken that way more seriously in the first century than we do. You don't break that off like we can. We kind of see engagement as a testing period mainly, and more than that. But it can be ended. But that it was taken a lot more seriously. So it could be. It'd be possible to see that right now it's in a period of an engagement, and then at the coming of Christ, we will then the marriage. That's the marriage ceremony. The marriage will be solidified and consummated, and we'll celebrate the marriage supper of the Lamb in joyful celebration of the result of the long period of engagement has now come to its conclusion with finally the bride and bridegroom. We'd say, and here they exchange their vows, and the wedding is finally comes to pass. The marriage is finally solidified and consummated, and that's kind of what's happening now in chapter 19. And that will prepare you for that. It's only an anticipation. It's like John. He does this a lot. He'll mention something and he'll stop short, but he'll pick it up later and develop it more. And that's what happens in 21. Is now. Verse 9, John's going to say, and an angel came to me and said, I'm going to show you the bridegroom of the Lamb. And so now we'll get the full picture of the bridegroom and the bride and his bridegroom in new creation.
Well, I love the wedding analogy because weddings are always such joyous occasion, and I think of Jesus really starting his ministry at that wedding in Cana, with all of his messaging around love and commitment and joy that it brings the community. Talk to us a little bit about, in verse 9 and 10, the blessedness of those who are invited to the wedding supper. Why is this invitation so significant, and who is included, and why are they all wearing white? Just because you wouldn't do that today.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the significance is, I think, being invited to the wedding ceremony, that just, I think, demonstrates the privilege of, some people might want to read like election and Calvinism into that, and that's fine. But to me, it's more that it's a privilege to be part of this, to be invited to this. And notice, too, it's interesting, this is kind of the way apocalyptic imagery works. The people of God are both the bride and their guest at the wedding. And that seems kind of odd to us, but that's kind of the way apocalyptic images and metaphor works. They can be both the bride and the guest at the wedding. They're both. And the point is, they are, these invited guests, they are privileged to be part of this and to belong to this and to be part of this wedding ceremony. And the white, again, just demonstrates the purity, the purity of the people of God who now stand before the bridegroom, before their husband, the Lamb. And even you find that in other places in the New Testament, even in Ephesians 5, in Paul's use of the marriage imagery. God's intention is to present his bride holy and blameless before him. And I think we see that in the imagery of the white robes that they know.
So the people who are there, as you said, they really are the faithful, the ones that are often referenced, the chosen faithful, or the ones who remain faithful.
Yes.
And by that is that we are believers in Christ, and that we obey him and stand firm and steadfast in our faith, regardless of the challenges that we may face.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right.
So that sounds like there'll be a lot of people I know there, which is kind of exciting.
Right.
A big wedding, so a lot of people will be there.
Lots of good food and drink.
Right, I mean, we'll have some Jesus wine, which is very hard to get, almost impossible. It's the best vineyard, and it's the best vintage. Right. Everything about it is perfect. It's going to be great. All right, so now we're going to go to this more stretch about really the rider and the white horse and the defeat of the beast. This is in 19:11 through 21. So in your book, you discuss the significance of the rider on the white horse. Could you elaborate on how you interpret this figure and the symbolism behind this depiction?
Yeah, but I mean, first of all, in verses 11 through, I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think. The next few verses.
You don't have a Bible right there? Where's your Bible?
I had one. Yeah, it doesn't inspire much confidence in your guest speaker that he doesn't have his Bible in front of him. But
I figured you would just know it all off the top of your head.
I know it starts at verse 11. The next few verses that describe the rider and the white horse, which clearly becomes Christ, as clearly as understand as Christ, is basically that it starts with, this is kind of a static scene. In other words, the author, John isn't seeing a vision of something Christ is doing. He's getting a description of a warrior. And so but all the language comes out of the Old Testament, and most of it in the Old Testament is applied to God. And now, so you have Jesus doing what God does in the Old Testament. Now Jesus is the warrior who's described, who is going to be the divine agent of judgment, of God's judgment on humanity. And so the first few verses are kind of setting you up by describing this warrior. And again, notice the language. He judges with justice and righteousness. So again, there's still that emphasis on, Jesus isn't coming just to take revenge and to, just so we can gloat on what God through Jesus is going to do to our enemies. But again, this is an expression of God's holiness and justice in sending his son, this rider on the white horse, to exact judgment and justice on the rebellious and those who resist him, those who have harmed God's people. And now it's like the first few verses are preparatory for the battle that's going to be described in the rest of chapter 19. It's like before the author gets there, he wants to make clear who this is, and to make sure why he has come. He has come as God's agent to bring about God's justice and righteousness on earth, using this warfare and this battle imagery.
I mean, it's very helpful to have that image in mind going into a battle scene, but yet there's no battle that actually takes place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He just...
Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, well, there's two things. Number one, I think it's emphasizing the sovereign power of God and the Lamb, that there's no fighting that takes place. Yeah. But I think
that's nice.
Yeah, it is. So you don't, and that's the thing. Even there's that description that the armies of heaven follow him. Well, they don't even do anything. It simply says that. And here's what the second thing I want to say. Here's the key. Not only does it first demonstrate God's and the Lamb's absolute sovereignty and power, that there's no fighting that takes place, but second is I don't think the author's referring to a literal battle at all. Notice Christ comes and simply judges them or destroy or slays them from the sword that comes out of his mouth. The sword is an image of judgment, and the fact that it comes out of his mouth simply means that Christ simply speaks the word of judgment and they're judged. So I think this warfare imagery is used as a symbol or image of a judgment scene where God simply, or Jesus simply speaks the word, and his enemies and the enemies of God's people are judged. So I think that's another reason why there's no fighting, because John isn't describing a literal battle. He's describing a judgment by using warfare, battle imagery to kind of enforce and make clear exactly what's happening.
And we can all relate to that or understand that imagery, right?
Yes.
Like we've all, whether we've been part of a war or whether we know family members or whether we just see it on the news, we understand that. I think it's interesting because you said you believe that's John, the author of the Gospel of John. And he starts out his gospel with this whole message about the Word. And in the beginning, there was God, and God was the Word. And now we see the Word being used, his words, as active judgment on people right here in this scene.
Yeah.
So he has a strong feeling about that, or he has a strong understanding of that, I guess would be the way to say it.
Yes, but and here that's interesting. You brought up John's gospel. This is the only other place except for John 1 where Jesus is called the Word. And the idea of word it's not just a nice title. It's word suggests revelation. So Jesus is here revealing the truth and the character of God in this judgment.
But also that the very words he speaks are action. Right. Like action comes from the very words he speaks. Right.
He simply speaks and God's judgment takes place.
And also he speaks healings and whatnot. So, when he speaks, it's, what do they say? No word from God ever, I forget, it's like something, ever... Yeah. Exactly. That one. That one. That's such a good one. I should memorize all of them. So there is this powerful confrontation. We've been talking about it. Christ, the beast, and the false prophet. Is this the scene that we might think of as Armageddon? Like, is this the one that we would refer to that?
Yes.
Right?
That's a really good point.
Okay.
If you go back to chapter 16, that's where the Battle of Armageddon is mentioned. It's like seal number 6, I think, the sixth seal, or I'm sorry, sixth bowl in chapter 16. That's where you have mention of the Battle of Armageddon. And all it says is the two beasts and the dragon come out and they gather the nations, or they gather the kings. They're gathered for the Battle of Armageddon. And it stops there. It doesn't say where, it doesn't mention any war. It just says they're gathered and it stops. Now here it is, I think. This is now the Battle of Armageddon. Those nations and kings that were gathered in chapter 16, now the battle is taking place. But as you said, Sandy, it's not a battle at all. Just, Christ comes down and through his spoken word, he judges the nations, and that's it. But this, I think you're right. This is the Battle of Armageddon that was referred to in chapter 16.
Doesn't seem like it's that bad of a battle. I mean, we're all afraid of it, but it feels like, hey, it's just he's gonna speak it into being, and then it's gonna be interesting from that point, because now we get into chapter 20 and the millennium and the final judgment. I know nobody ever asked you about this, so I'm going to be the first one to ask you this question. The millennium in Revelation 20 has been interpreted in various ways. Can you believe that? Could you share your perspective from your book about the topic of the millennium and how it's represented, and also why it's gotten so much attention?
Yes. I think sometimes I wonder why it did. It just looking throughout church history, for some reason, the millennium has become almost the centerpiece of our eschatology and our end time views. And so people, the first thing they ask is, "What's your view of the millennium?" Or they'll even ask me about Revelation. Do you hold a non-millennial or premillennial or whatever millennial approach to Revelation? So that it's like that has become a centerpiece. But the interesting thing is when you read it, verses 4 through 6, chapter 24 through 6, that's it. That's all the Bible says about the millennium. And it is so cryptic and short. I mean, it's not even clear where it takes place. And it doesn't tell you who's there or what happens there. All it says is the saints came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. That's all that it says. And I know that some people from the movement known as dispensationalism that I came out of, they see the millennium as that's where Israel will be restored to their land, and the temple will be rebuilt, and sacrificial system reinstituted, and a Davidic king ruling over them, etc. But again, if you read 4 through 6, I don't see any of that happening.
So where is it all coming from?
Yeah.
Like, are they just extracting it to try? First of all, I have to ask, the 1,000 years, like we talked about how numbers aren't really necessarily numbers. Is that true in this case?
Yeah, I think the 1,000 years is meant to be taken symbolically or metaphorically. So John's not referring to a literal period of time, or not even necessarily a long period of time at all. Because, he uses, I think all his numbers in the book of Revelation are meant, like the number 7, or we talked about the number 12 is symbolic of the people of God. And so 1,000 is just, a large number, a large complete number. In fact, if you look at the term 1,000 years, all the other numbers in Revelation, all the other time periods pale in comparison. We read about 1 hour, 10 days, 3.5 years, 1,260 days, 42 months, and now 1,000. So what is John?
A big
Yeah, it's a
number.
big number. What is John saying is not, oh, the millennium is going to literally be 1,000 years of 360 days. No, the point is he's contrasting this with the other numbers that are usually used in connection with the reign of the beast and the beast oppression of God's people, which was 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. Those numbers all suggest a short, limited period of time. Now, 1,000 years. What John saying is the vindication, I'll come back to vindication, but the vindication of God's people, the reward of God's people will far it will overcompensate.
Surpass.
It will far surpass and overcompensate for anything they experienced under the reign of the beast. This is so much greater. This is the reward and the vindication. It pales, or what they suffered under the beast pales in comparison to what they will receive, how they will be rewarded and vindicated when they're raised and reign with Christ. That's the message of the millennium, not how long is this going to be, and what's going to take place, and who's going to be there, and what's life going to be like, and read Revelation. I always tell people to go back, read those verses 4-6, and tell me what happens there. Nothing. We don't even know.
Well,
it's just the saints come to life and reign with Christ. That's all it says, and it's.
Are they just concerned about, are they part of the saints that reign with Christ? I mean, what is their primary motivation for dissecting this so much?
I think a lot of it is, for some people, they, as I read, first of all, it has a long history going way back to the 3rd, 4th century of seeing the millennium as the place where God physically, in an earthly sense, fulfills his promises. And I still see that today as some people are convinced we have to have a millennium, a long period of time, because that's where God has to establish his promises on this earth. He has to kind of vindicate this present creation. And so I think you see a lot of times people wanting to make the millennium a place where God kind of sets things right in this world, this creation. I had one.
And you don't see it like that. You don't see it.
No,
that way.
I think where God makes this creation right is in chapter 21 and 22, the new heavens and the new earth.
Okay.
That's not something way out there. I had one of my professors say, think that's God can't keep his promises in some new creation way out there. And my response is, that's not a new creation way out there. That is this creation renewed and redeemed and restored. That's where the promises are fulfilled, not in the millennium. I'll talk a little bit more about why a millennium. God's promises are fulfilled in the new creation, and that's why it's just so strange to me that so much attention has been given to the millennium, where when it plays an important but a rather limited and minor role in the outworking of God's promises and in the fulfillment of his promises. It's like the grand finale is 21 and 22. That's where Revelation is moving towards, not towards a millennium. It's 21 and 22, the new.
So there's sort of like we're getting stuck on something that has less importance than what's to come.
That's right. That's right. And obviously it's important because it's in Revelation, but that's not the goal. Right. You're right. It has less importance than John's main focus is on 21 and 22. That's the grand finale of the firework display. That's where everything takes place.
Well, it's hard for me to understand it. I do know that people are pretty passionate about it, and they like to discuss it. But you're right. If you said, open up the book and show me where it supports your opinion of what is happening here, they wouldn't find anything.
No, you don't. And usually our view of the millennium usually doesn't depend on Revelation 20. It depends on understanding the Old and New Testament more broadly. And again, wanting to find, especially the Old Testament promises made to Israel were very wrapped up with the land and the earth
Yes.
and the physical people. And so, we want to find those promises fulfilled somewhere in this earth, in this present creation, and the millennium is the place where that often takes place. But again, to me, that's separate. That's like, to say, well, 21 and 22, that doesn't count as a place where God could fulfill his earthly promises. That doesn't count. That's some no, it's not. That's one analogy I heard one time. Is say it'd be like having two people having a competition with their vehicles to see who could carry the most boxes, and someone with a pickup could load up their back, and the person with a small Toyota would say, well, that doesn't count because it has to be enclosed within your car. It has to, and the whole point is, no, that's the whole reason the truck was built, for that, the bed in the back to carry luggage. So and that's kind of what's happening if you disqualify 21 and 22 and say, well, that's out there. So, no, that's the whole purpose for the book of Revelation. That's a whole purpose for God's redemptive activity, to establish a new creation. And so, and that's why in 21 and 22, I know where I'm jumping the gun. I'm jumping ahead a little bit.
It's okay. You go right ahead.
That's why in 21 and 22, that's where you find all the Old Testament texts quoted and alluded to from the Old Testament of God establishing his promises, not in Revelation 20 in the millennium, but later on in 21 and 22.
I like your story, your narrative that everything must go, if you will, before he establishes the new. And it's not an actual literal new earth. It's the way earth was intended to be, which I know we're going to talk about that. But this progression of that, things have to happen before that's the case. Everything has to go. This kind of just fits into that part of the story, of the narrative, right? This is just a small part of what's going to come.
Right. And
is that
it is. And you're exactly right. Chapter 20, and this is the other thing, the main point of chapter 20 is not the millennial reign of the saints. It's the judgment of Satan.
Yeah. Right.
We have still more, and even after Satan's judged, than the great white throne. So chapter 20 is not about the millennium. The main point is still the judgment of Satan.
I'm going to tell everybody that.
Yeah, do that.
It's really...
It is. I mean,
it's really more...
It helps me understand, so what's the millennium about? Well, it's to show, in the midst of all this judgment, God hasn't forgotten his people. And especially with Satan, why is he saved for last? He's the ringleader of everything. So what did Satan do, and what did the beast do to God's people? They put them, in Revelation, they put them to death, and they reign, the Satan and the two beasts oppressively rule over the saints. Now, in a profound reversal, Satan is judged, and the saints come to life, and they reign. So those that Satan put to death and ruled over come to life, and they reign. So the whole point of the millennium, verses 4 through 6, is simply to show, in the context of Satan's judgment, God hasn't forgotten about his people. He vindicates them and rewards them. The guilty party is judged, and those that Satan wrongly accused and put to death and ruled over unjustly, now they are vindicated and they come to life. That's all the millennium does.
Well, I think that's such a strong message about, he's, even in the midst of it all, he's still with us, his people. Yeah. You are my people. Yes. And you always will be. So, okay, well, about this whole judgment of Satan, you talk about the binding of Satan in 21 through 3. How do you understand the purpose and nature of this binding him? And what should we take away from that today? What should we think about that today?
The interesting thing with the binding of Satan is then he's let out.
Yeah, right. Why? I mean, and again, it does talk about then after 1,000 years, he's released. So how do they fit together the binding and the release?
Yeah, and I have to admit, I'm still perplexed by this. Surprise, surprise. Revelation is still perplexing. I'm still perplexed by some of this.
But I was told you were an expert on everything and you knew it all. So go ahead, give us your best guess.
So the idea that Satan is bound in the abyss and then he's let out only to be judged. He's thrown into the lake of fire.
Right.
What I think John may be doing is, you actually find this in the book of Isaiah, chapter 24. You find this in Jude and 2 Peter. And then you find this in some apocalyptic texts that aren't in the Old and New Testament. Like, you can Google them, like First Enoch and Second Enoch. But First Enoch in like chapter 5, chapter 10, the way that Satan is judged and the way that the demons are judged in those chapters and in Jude and 2 Peter and Isaiah 24 is they are bound. It says they're bound in chains awaiting the day of judgment. So like there's a two-stage judgment. First of all, they're bound in chains, often in an abyss, in a prison, awaiting the day of judgment. And so you find both of those in Revelation. So Satan is first of all bound in the abyss, and I take it he's awaiting the day of judgment, which happens in connection with the battle. Satan's let out. It says yes, and that's kind of weird. He's released. So why does he need to be released? But exactly. But I think that's why John does have him in chains in the abyss, only to be judged later and to be cast into the lake of fire, because he's following this common theme that you find in some of these apocalypses, like First Enoch, that you find in Isaiah 24, Jude verse 6, 2 Peter chapter 2, that the angels are bound in darkness awaiting the day of judgment. And so now Satan's bound in the abyss and awaiting the day of judgment when he'll be cast in the lake of fire. But what John does is in his vision, he sees an additional element. He's going to integrate that into something else, and that is Satan is also going to be defeated in an end time battle, just like the beast were in chapter 19. Yeah. So you have Satan being released. He's able to gather the nations into a final battle. But again, it's no different than the one in chapter 19. There's no fighting. God just sends fire from heaven and judges them, and they're done. So that's kind of my best guess is, John's kind of working with a couple of things. This idea of here's how in apocalyptic texts, here's how Satan and demons are judged. They're locked in judgment, and they're locked in an abyss, or they're locked in chains, and they're in a prison, and they're awaiting the day of judgment. That two-stage judgment. And then in between that, John also inserts a vision of Satan being judged just like the beast were in the end-time battle.
So if they're bound and they're in the abyss, how are they free to seemingly roam the world and still cause havoc? People will say that. Do you think demons are still on the planet today causing havoc? I say yes. Yeah. So how are they somehow able to do something, but they're in the abyss? Maybe I just don't have the timing right.
No, that's a good point, because Jesus uses the image of binding the strong man or binding Satan in the Gospels. And so I think this is a different binding. This is the final at the second coming.
Okay, so this is what's going to happen at the second coming. So it's kind
of got that already, but not yet. Satan's already bound in Jesus' ministry. When Jesus casts out demons in his ministry, Satan is bound. But he's still, that's only partial. He's still free to deceive people and tempt people and harm people. But now this is the not yet. This is the final binding where Satan is bound. And I'm convinced the readers of Revelation, they'd read that and say, oh yeah, when it says then after a little while Satan is let out, I don't think they'd respond, oh no, what's going to happen next? As they would know, oh, that means he's going to go into judgment.
Okay, they knew the sequence.
Right, they would view that sequence in light of those passages like in Enoch and Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2 and Isaiah 24. But John says, but before he does, he's going to be defeated in a battle just like the beast were in chapter 19.
Okay.
So it's like, it cut, to me, it just, thinking in terms of modern day, it does show the complexity of evil and what it takes for, God to deal with it
even though Christ died on the cross for us and defeated Satan, he's still free to do evil work until the final judgment.
Right.
Which can be slightly hard to understand.
Right.
But also, if you see the big picture, you can see that's true. And yet we don't really want to have him around anymore. Right. So I don't know.
Right. No, you're
right.
Exactly
Evil
right.
Is...
It's just part of that. Satan. I mean, even you see this back in chapter 12 of Revelation. Satan he's cast out of heaven. He's defeated by Michael and his archangels. But it says he's been defeated. But then it says he knows his time is short. So his anger is great and he goes after the people of God. So you have this idea he's already defeated, but he's still able to deceive the world. He's still able to harm God's people, but his time is short. And that's why he's doing this, because he's ultimately, chapter 20, he's ultimately going to meet his final doom and his final judgment.
And he knows it's coming. And we can't wait for that, because then we're going to live in creation without his influence.
Yes.
Which is the most important part of the whole thing. That's right.
So he's part of those those removals. Chapter 20, he's removed, so he can no longer deceive, he can no longer harm, and he's.
I mean, that's not so easy to get rid of him.
And that's good, and that's the point. I wonder if that's the point, by having he's bound, but he's let out, and he can deceive. But it's like no, he's not easy to get. Yeah, God is more powerful, but just demonstrating.
Right.
He's not easy to get rid of.
Well, it's not easy because he's in people, right? Like people are loyal to him simply by choosing him over Jesus, or not making a choice.
And which they do in chapter 20. He's able to go deceive them into a final battle. So you're right. It's like he's in. People still want to follow him and give him allegiance, and not the wrong.
And there's a lot of them on the planet. So removing his influence, it's not as easy as It's just not that easy.
Right.
So I can see why there's such a big, important amount of detail around it.
Yes, you're right. I think you're right. That's why there's so much detail. That's why the author takes so much time to describe his judgment in comparison to the two beasts. I mean, they're just destroyed, thrown like a fire. Satan takes longer. It's like, no, this is more important. This is the foe that he lies behind the two beasts, behind Babylon, behind everything. And
he's the main antagonist of the story.
We're going to take more time just to describe his defeat and judgment.
Which I think is valuable for us to feel good about it.
Yeah.
So you talk about the judgment that happens, the judgment of the dead. Explain the significance of this judgment and what it means for humanity. And also just speak to the fact that if this judgment was really about Babylon and Rome, how do we find application beyond the first century, beyond the Roman Empire? If that end-time judgment didn't happen when Rome fell. So maybe combine those.
Good. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
That'll be easy for
You
you.
have another
You're
hour
welcome.
or so? I'm not sure I can combine both.
Sure.
Well, no, that's good.
No.
When we think of the judgment scene, again, people tend to look at Revelation. Oh, it's just about judgment and gloom and doom. But no. Once more, the way I look at it is God is removing everything that would. It's not just God's mad at people and He's going to start getting rid of them, but God is now removing anything that would harm His intent to establish a just, righteous, and loving world, which He does in 21 and 22. What He's removing is, in removing the beast and Satan and all those who follow them, is these are ones that would continue to perpetrate injustice and harm and evil. And they refuse to repent, and so God will remove them in judgment, and has to, if He is going to establish a world that is just and holy and righteousness and loving and merciful, which again He does in 21 and 22. The other thing about the judgment scenes too is not only that perspective, but how should some of the churches in chapter 2 and 3 understand the judgment scenes, especially Laodicea? They probably are not going to read this as a comfort. It's a warning: is you don't.
Yeah, they're in bad shape.
You're bad. You don't want to be on the wrong side of God's judgment. And
No.
I know we're opposed in our churches to message of judgment and scaring people, and that's not the main goal, just to frighten them. But I think there is some of that they're to read this and say, I don't want to be on the wrong end of God's judgment. I don't want to be excluded from eternal life in God's presence, and leading them to repent, as chapters 2 and 3 call the 5 churches to do that are not maintaining their faithful witness. So this would be a call for those Christians today that don't care about their walk with Christ and their witness, and think maybe that God's grace and forgiveness covers all my sins, I can do whatever I want. Is a scene like this is going to say, no, there are consequences. You don't want to be in the wrong side of God's judgment. These visions and scenes of judgment are an opportunity to repent or to take seriously our relationship with Jesus Christ.
I feel like when I was growing up, that message of judgment was so much more prevalent than it is today.
Mm-hmm.
I guess because it's not popular.
Right.
But, excuse me, it was like the primary way that evangelists put forth the message then. And you don't hear it now. I do think it's missing. I think that there's a void there without it.
I do too. And you think about it. I mean, maybe if I'm dealing with someone just pastorally that they're worried that, have I done something? Does God really love me? Maybe
Yes.
I'm not going to say, look at the judgment scene, but what about for those people that say, I don't care. I want to live my life. I call myself a Christian, but I don't want, Christ can't, I don't want Him telling me what to do. I want to live my own.
Right.
Do they need to hear, that's okay, God loves you and He died for your sins? So no, they probably need to hear, no, there are consequences for going down that road, and judgment. Mm-hmm. Not that you would use this on everybody, but judgment scenes are, again, if this is addressed to those 7 churches, the whole book, some of them are going to look at these judgment scenes as not about those people out there, but about them.
A wake-up call, if you will.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, I like it.
Or a wake-up call.
Well, we talked about how the Left Behind series brought that to the forefront.
Yeah.
For all of its pros and cons, it did do a good job of that.
But the Babylon piece.
So, the Babylon piece. Yeah.
So if I've said a couple times, especially when you read chapter 18, and particularly the description of Babylon as the beast is, or the 7 heads are 7 hills.
Right.
that was a common
Rome.
description of Rome, and anybody that heard that would say, "Aha, this is Rome." I mean, that'd be like, if I said the city of brotherly love. I mean, we don't talk about that anymore, but everybody'd know that's Philadelphia. We don't use that imagery. Or sin, city of sin.
Sin City. Yeah.
So people hear seven hills. Aha, that's Rome. And Rome was judged and destroyed later on, but obviously the end didn't come. 2,000 years after Revelation is written, we're still here. So what's going on?
Yeah.
Is again, I think for John, and this is true of the beast too. If the beast is Rome in chapter 12 and especially 13, if the beast is the Roman Empire and the Roman emperor, what's he doing still running around at the final judgment in chapter 19?
Right.
And so what I think is going on is often what John does in using this imagery of beasts or Babylon is he's using images that do two things. Number one, they more describe the power or what is going on underneath the visible manifestation. So and then second is what was the second thing I was going to say? Therefore, that power, even though Rome might pass away, that power that underlies it, the source of the idolatry and the godlessness that underlies it, might continue to exist. In the same way that the beast represents the power of chaos and evil and deception and oppression of God's people. That was existing in Rome, but even when Rome is gone, that can continue to exist until Christ comes back to put an end to it. And so I think that's what you have going on is, Babylon was judged. Babylon did fall in the form of the fall of the Roman Empire. But because Christ did not come back right away, that image has the power to continue to exert itself until Christ comes back to bring it to an end. So that's why we can see, as we talked about a little bit in one of the previous podcasts, we can talk about how we see Babylon in our world today. Not necessarily in one person or nation, although it could be, but we can see it throughout the world. We can see it influencing our own lives and our own culture.
And also over and over and over throughout time.
Over and over and over throughout history.
The rise and the fall, the rise and the fall. Yeah. And
it will continue. We can see the beast at work, even apart from the Roman Empire, until Christ comes back to put it to an end. So that's kind of, it's like John's images, they have the power to extend beyond the first century until Christ comes back. And that doesn't mean that John predicted and he saw the United States or Nazi Germany or things like that. He didn't. It just means he understood that this power behind Rome would continue until Christ came back to judge it. And therefore, I talked about the image, kind of the image last week. If the prophetic cap fits, you have to wear it.
Yeah.
And so until Babylon is finally brought to an end at the second coming, any nation, any society, any culture, any empire, any person that embodies that must wear that cap.
Well, I like the fact that you said he understood it would extend. I mean, this was what was relevant right then, and the power of Rome. All that would have been people would have been so aware of it. I guess suppose today we might look at other nations and say the same thing. I know we would.
Right.
So just the foresight to help set it up, like this is going to continue to happen until Christ comes back.
And obviously John didn't know how long that would be. He wasn't saying, this is going to be 2,000 or 3,000 years. I mean, for him, Jesus could have come back right when Rome was destroyed. But obviously, John wasn't predicting that. John was not trying to predict the coming of Christ. He's just saying Babylon is the power behind Rome, and it is going to be judged and destroyed. And it was in the first, a few centuries after John wrote.
It was.
Jesus didn't come back, but John wasn't saying he had to. John just saw that Babylon will reach its final judgment. The beasts will reach their final judgment when Christ returns.
Well, now I'm kind of anxious for him to come back after that discussion. Because it's going to be amazing.
Maybe he could wait till our podcast is over, though.
Yeah, it has to air so people understand more about it, and then they won't be so surprised. All right, so these 2 chapters, which are so fascinating, do you have a key message about them or a hope for our listeners that you want them to take away from those passages? I
think it's the fact that God is one day. God's plan is to set everything right. What went wrong in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. God is at work setting everything right, and one day he will, again, everything that makes this world miserable at times. Miserable. School shootings and pain and death and disappointments and broken relationships and wars and living under the threat of nuclear wars or whatever, and economic collapse. One day that God is in the process of removing all that and fixing all that. To me, that's the message of 19 and 20.
My husband Rich always says, well, I don't understand why God didn't just come back and fix it right after the Garden of Eden. Like, it would have been so much easier, right? Like, fewer people, less of a presence. Mm-hmm. I guess we're going to have to find that out when we get there, right?
Yes.
It's like a hard road, baby. But also there must be.
And again, I think a lot of it is, for some, God has chosen to work that way. But I think part of it too is God is building hope and character in his people, God isn't in a hurry. We said yesterday, God does. We see, God should. Why didn't he? And I wonder the same thing. Why didn't God come back in Genesis 4 and just fix it? But they
just start over.
God isn't in a hurry. He sees time from the perspective of one who is eternal. And again, what seems like a long time, what seems like a delay to us, why didn't you do it sooner? To him is, First Peter says, to God, a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years like a day. And I don't think he's saying God can't distinguish time. He's just saying what appears to be long to us isn't to him.
Well, I'm grateful because there have been a lot of people that have been born and found Christ, and that will be with us in that great banquet. We'll be all rejoicing together. I'm eating really good food.
I'm grateful for the delay. I've had kids and I have grandkids, and
I know.
On a very practical level, that wouldn't be true if Christ came back when I wanted him to.
I would like to have my children and my grandchildren and their kids also experience the love of God and to know Christ. Well, this was really fascinating. Again, it's just so, eye-opening the way you describe it. And again, I would just say to people, go to Amazon and find this great little companion guide to Revelation. I'm sure we'll have a link somewhere on the podcast right to that page as well. But our next podcast, our final one, we get to talk about all the good stuff, like all the great stuff that's going to happen. And we've gotten through all the so-called battles and the judgment. Now we get to see what God has in mind. And I think that's going to be super fun. So thank you again. And we will talk to you very soon. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.